Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we are talking more about Tesla stock, which continues to run. We have updated analyst notes from Credit Suisse, and then we have Goldman Sachs initiating coverage on the stock. And then we also have another third row Tesla podcast interview to discuss with Elon Musk and Sandy Munro. We'll start first with the stock, which, despite falling towards the end of the day today, did finish up another 9% to $709.89. That compared to the NASDAQ up about 4%. And then in the after-hour session today, Tesla up another $36 to $746.50. Obviously, we went through a lot of reasons for the strength in the stock yesterday, but we have a couple more to add today. Before the markets opened on Tuesday, Credit Suisse analyst Dan Levy upgraded Tesla from underperform to neutral with a $580 price target, up from his previous target of $415 per share. We've been talking recently about how Tesla's competitive advantage is actually improving with this macro environment situation, and that was a factor that Levy called out in his note, saying that Tesla now, quote, competitively has more advantage in the transition to electric vehicles, as coronavirus disruption will make it more difficult for legacy automakers to balance the long-term shift to electric vehicles in the face of near-term cycle disruption, end quote. So obviously that is a thesis that I agree with. I mean, if we look at the other automakers' actions in a pretty strong macro environment the last few years, even in that environment, they've been extremely hesitant to fully pursue electric vehicles and to make those investments. And last year, we talked about it a lot. We've already seen really poor financial performances from a lot of other automakers, a lot of that due to emissions scandals and emissions requirements increasing. So layering on an economic downturn to already extremely slow progress, I mean, it's pretty clear how that ends up. Collectively, not every single individual at every single OEM, but collectively, these legacy automakers are managed by short-term thinking, and unfortunately, one of the best ways to optimize the short term is to make cuts to those projects that are only going to have a long-term positive return, and unfortunately, EV development is a prime example of that. Anyway, the strong macro environment today with the NASDAQ up 4%, plus this note before market open, definitely helped the stock performance today. And then specifically today after market close at 6:07 p.m. Eastern Time to be precise, we had an updated note on Tesla from Goldman Sachs. If you've been following Tesla for a while, you remember that historically Goldman Sachs has had an analyst, David Tamburino, covering the stock and has always been extremely bearish on it. I don't remember a single time where he did not have a sell rating on the stock, but sometime in the last 6 to 12 months, Goldman Sachs actually dropped coverage of Tesla stock. So today they have reinitiated coverage with an $864 price target and a new analyst. After that news hit in the after hours, about 15-20 minutes later, the stock price shot up by $20 to $30. So the lead analyst now for Goldman Sachs on Tesla is Mark Delaney, and essentially the note boils down to Goldman Sachs believing that Tesla has a lead in electric vehicles, which is likely to continue, and they believe in the secular growth of the EV market. As far as the projections go, they are forecasting $27.8 billion in revenue for 2020, $45.5 for 2021, and $58.5 for 2022. And then for the earnings per share numbers, for 2021, $15 earnings per share, and 2022, $20 earnings per share. From the rest of the note, I think the most interesting piece of information that I saw in there was something that Goldman Sachs is looking at. They say, quote, we examined the correlation of Tesla app downloads, which are available on a weekly basis with a small lag, to car deliveries and found a good correlation, so we plan to continue to monitor this metric to help gauge Tesla's results, end quote. They have a chart demonstrating this. There are some periods of time where there is a pretty significant variance, so it's never going to be perfect. But it is interesting, especially so if institutional investors are going to be watching that as a signal. Then I think it's something that we as retail investors should be definitely keeping an eye on. So hopefully we'll come back to that idea. I'm not exactly sure how that app download tracking works. I'll look into it soon, but let me know if you know in the comments. So overall with this note, as I said, strong after hours trading based off of it, and we'll see how the market reacts tomorrow. But I would guess that some of this has already been influencing the stock trading over the last couple of days. I wouldn't be surprised if there had been some front running based on this note coming out. Next topic I wanted to discuss today was the third row interview with Elon and Sandy Munro. This came out later on Tuesday. Definitely would encourage people to check that out. It's about an hour and 10 minutes. Elon is on for about the first half, and I wanted to go through my notes on my takeaways from this interview. Overall, I would say nothing earth-shatteringly new. There were a couple of fun new tidbits in there. The majority of the discussion from Elon was around Model Y, specifically around two of the biggest improvements for the Model Y from the Model 3, which we've talked about, and that's the heat pump design, sort of in tandem with the octavalve, and then the rear underbody casting. On the heat pump, he said that's basically the biggest factor allowing the Model Y range to be similar to the Model 3, despite being about a 10% larger vehicle overall. This was engineering work from Tesla that Elon was super proud of, particularly with the heat pump. He talked a lot about the local heating loop element to the heat pump that Tesla added, noting that typically in really low temperatures, heat pumps have issues spooling up. But basically through the integration of the octo valve, Tesla is using that to exchange heat between many different parts of the vehicle as efficiently as possible, and it seems to be sort of always evaluating the best route for all of that. And a part of that is the functionality at low temperatures, which I definitely don't claim to fully understand, but essentially Elon described it as utilizing that local heating loop before opening the valve that would allow it to try to heat the cabin, with Elon saying, quote, "That local loop part is very important for low temperatures," end quote. And then as we have seen him mention on Twitter, he also talked about the concept of applying printed circuit board techniques to the cooling circuits in the heat pump, which allows Tesla to create a very complex heat exchanger that you can't do with tubes traditionally, which Elon described by saying, quote, "This is like quite a fundamental paradigm shift. Like I've never seen anything like it before. I haven't even heard of anything like it, quite frankly," end quote. And this is engineering that Elon is so impressed with that he actually has a printed circuit board heat exchanger in his bedroom, which he said he doesn't have a lot of stuff like that in there. So for non-engineers, I think it's pretty difficult to understand this stuff from a more than fundamental level. But the fact that Elon is so proud of this that he actually has a version of it in his bedroom, that is pretty telling. So a lot of time discussing that and essentially crediting it for about a 10% improvement in range for the Model Y. The other big thing was the rear underbody casting. So we've talked about this before. The variance here from the Model Y to the Model 3 is the Model 3 uses stamping. So Elon said it's like a million little stampings. It achieves the function of being very safe, but the complexity in the body shop, specifically in Fremont, he said was insane and feels like a, quote, "Dickensian nightmare," end quote, which is a reference to Charles Dickens and can be interpreted in different ways, but essentially is bleak scenes of hardship. But for the Model Y, Elon said, quote, "The current version of the Model Y has basically two big high-pressure die-cast aluminum castings that are joined, and there's still a bunch of other bits that are attached, and then later this year, we will be transitioning to the rear underbody being a single-piece casting that also integrates the rear crash rails," end quote. He also then added, quote, "This is like a big deal, by the way. It gets better," end quote. Later also adding the word profound to his description of this change. Interestingly, on the casting, Elon said they were sort of inspired by little model vehicles. So, they make the smaller Model S vehicles, and Elon or the team was looking at that and asked the question of, okay, these are made with casting. What's the physical limitation on casting, and can we just do this with a giant car? They said they couldn't do it with a full car because that would require about a 15,000 ton casting machine, which Elon said felt pretty crazy, so they went with a smaller casting machine, 6,000 ton casting machine, which is the largest casting machine in the world. Sounds like right now Tesla's got one and another one coming next month. Elon said those casting machines are the size of a small house. The benefit to doing this casting, though, is very significant. Elon says, quote, "It has a big effect on the ease of manufacturing, like a really big effect. Effectively, the manufacturing cost is much less, and we see about a 30% reduction in the size of the body shop," end quote. Somebody on the podcast, I think Omar, asked if this would come to the Model 3 then because of these savings, and Elon basically said that maybe they would do that in a couple of years, but they really just need to prioritize what makes sense to pursue. These developments with Model Y would obviously improve the Model 3 as well, but they would require a lot of remanufacturing and things like that, and it takes a lot of work to go backward and change those things. So those were kind of the two big things. They did also talk about the wiring. That was one area that we expected pretty big improvement for with the Model Y that we haven't necessarily seen come to fruition. Elon wasn't necessarily addressing that specifically to the Model Y, but more in general about wiring. He said, quote, "We've not been successful thus far in automating a lot of the wiring," end quote. But that beyond that, they have done a lot of simplifying so that there's less work to do on the wiring. Elon definitely hasn't given up on the idea of significantly reducing the wiring though, so I would expect that to happen in a future iteration of Tesla's vehicles. Other than that, they did talk a little bit about the Cybertruck, mostly stuff that we've heard before, and then factories saying Shanghai is an improvement over Fremont, and Berlin will be a further improvement over Shanghai. And Elon pointed out that it's not all just cost cutting when they're making these improvements, saying that the Berlin paint shop would add some new technology that will just create a better paint experience, basically saying that it would allow for another 3 layers of paint, which Elon said will add dimension to how the paint looks visually, saying, quote, "It just pops," end quote. So probably a small thing to a lot of people, but It kind of takes me back a little bit to the Model X days, which I've been, I guess privately lamenting. I mentioned on the podcast like one time, but I sort of miss those days when Elon was really focused on sort of making a vehicle that's 10 times better than any vehicle that's ever existed. That was sort of the goal with Model X, paraphrasing. But obviously that caused a lot of production challenges, and I think they've since diverted to making things very simple, and that's the wise and correct move to make. But it was fun just as a consumer seeing Tesla push things forward like that. And certainly that's still a huge part of Tesla, but it is different than it was during the Model X era, and just having a little bit of that flavor back, at least being talked about, is kind of nice. Anyway, back to that interview. The second half was around Munro. Elon had dropped off. It was pretty interesting. Munro gave some of his own personal background. I didn't have a ton of takeaways from that, but Munro did talk a little bit about competition, which I always think is interesting because he does have conversations with those people. And when asked why competitors are having such a difficult time competing with Tesla, he basically said that competition really believes the good old days are going to come back. So, we talk about this all the time. I doubt most people believe that it's going to come back. I think they're probably just milking the good old days for as long as they can, rather than doing that hard but right thing, which is, of course, investing in electric vehicles, as we talked about at the beginning. The other thing that I thought was interesting from Munro was his mentioning that casting and aluminum both are not really heavily utilized by other OEMs. So if it wasn't already clear from Elon's discussion, Tesla's definitely pushing things forward in this regard. No surprise, but nice to hear that perspective. Sandy Munro, by the way, which should be pretty clear from the teardowns, is very positive about the Model Y and said he's already recommended it to 4 or 5 people to purchase. Last quick thing to mention today, which I haven't had a ton of time to look into, but it is starting to generate some headlines, is news on China registrations for the month of March for Tesla. So Reuters has picked this up. They are getting their data from automotive consultancy LMC Automotive, and they're reporting that Tesla's China registrations increased in March to 12,709 units, up from 2,314 in February. I would assume that that number includes imports. As we said, production is estimated around 10,000 units for Gigafactory Shanghai for March. So I think that 12,000 number is a strong number and kind of makes sense given production. That'll wrap it up for today. As always, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up for notifications. And make sure you're following me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast. Also, if you're on YouTube, sorry about the lack of video. It just hasn't fit into the schedule the last couple of days. Hopefully should be back to that tomorrow. I'll see you then for the Wednesday, April 15th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.